Welcome to Payroll Setup Lesson number 9 on Working in the Employer Liabilities tab. When you get the system, you will see a list of many different employer liabilities already pre-built for you. For example, every state has its own SUTA or state unemployment. So we can do the same thing in here as we can with taxes, and that is to go through the list of the employer liabilities that we do not normally deal with, and we can check them. So as you can see, as I scroll through my list, I have checked all the states that I don't deal with. So there's a check mark next to each of them. I have left open, however, the federal unemployment tax, the 2 FICA matches, and the state unemployment that I deal with. So once you have checked in here all of the employer liabilities that you don't deal with, what you can do is hide them. So I'm going to go up to View, Hide Selected ER Liabilities. So that when you first get the system, you should end up with 4 liabilities in this list. As you can see here, I also have a lot of union benefits set up in here that I'll talk about in a moment. But when you're first starting out, you should see 4, maybe even 5 employer liabilities in here that you normally deal with. By hiding them, you're doing 2 things. You're taking them out of the lists in the rest of the system as we begin setting it up, so that you're not having to scroll through a lot of different liabilities. And you're also taking them off of the employer liabilities reports that the payroll program prints out. So it is important that you hide the liabilities that you don't normally deal with. Now, in the case of your unemployment, taxes, both your federal and your state, and your 2 FICAs, there is a little bit of setup that you need to do. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to double click on the federal unemployment tax, and it brings the record out at the right where I can edit it then. So as I press enter through these fields, the first thing I'm going to do is relate the liability that I'm working on here to my general ledger chart of accounts. And in the case of any liability, there are 2 accounts that you need to relate the liability to. The first one is the liability in the account in the GL. Okay? The liability account is on the balance sheet in your general ledger, or the top part of your chart of accounts. And the liability account in the general ledger keeps track of how much you have had of this liability calc'd against that account and how much you have paid against it. So by the end of the year, hopefully that is zeroed out. Now when I press enter, I'm also brought down to an expense account in the general ledger, because liabilities have 2 sides to them. The liability account in the general ledger, and then the expense side. And the expense side of the general ledger shows you or tells you how much the company has paid for that liability, because liabilities are always paid on behalf of the employee. They're not reduced or deducted from the employee's paycheck. So it's important that we have these 2 accounts set up in here. That's all we need to do for our federal unemployment. So I can resave this, and as I do, it will refresh this list, and I can see the changes that I made to this line as I scroll to the right. All right? So we don't need to change anything other than these 2 fields. Okay. Now you want to do the same thing for your FICA. Double click on it, relate it to your general ledger accounts, and resave it. Same thing with your FICA Social Security. You can double click on it, change these 2 accounts, and resave it. Okay? Now in the case of your FICA Social Security, sometimes there are changes to the amount of Social Security that can be taken out of the checks and that the employer has to pay on behalf of the employee. So once you've resaved the liability, you can go into the Levels tab, and then you can change the level of the liability. So the rate probably won't change much, but the level did change in 2005 from $87,000 up to $90,000 a year. So if somebody gets paid up to $90,000 a year, not only are they having that amount of tax taken out of their for Social Security, but the employer is also matching up to $90,000 worth of tax regarding FICA Social Security. So that's why it's important to go into the levels after you have entered or you're editing any of your liabilities. The same thing, by the way, with your SUDA, because the one unknown when we send this out is what your particular rate is. So I'm double clicking on Minnesota's SUDA record, and as I press enter down the right side, I've related it to my liability account in the general ledger and my expense account. I shouldn't need to change like the calculation method because we already know that that's working right. We're just editing this record. So as I click save here, the next thing I want to do is go into the levels. Notice that it says Minnesota State Unemployment, so I know which one I'm working on. And when I go into the levels, then I can double click on that line and customize the maximum amount and even the rate, your particular rate, which is custom to each business. And as I press enter, I'm encouraged to save it, and I will answer yes to that, so then it's redisplayed with the changes that I've made. Now let's talk about other types of liabilities, because there are a lot of different types of liabilities, and when I click open this drop down, you get an idea of all the different types of liabilities that you can set up in the payroll program. Now the only ones that you may have to set up are your workman's compensation liabilities and then your union benefits too. We also have those set up as employer liabilities, although they could be set up as benefits. That's essentially what they are, though. They're benefits paid on behalf of the employee by the employer. So we encourage union benefits to also be set up in here. So when we talk about setting up a liability, all we do is click the New button, and we're taken over to the right side of the screen where then we select what type of liability we're setting up. And I'm going to set up actually a workman's comp code to show you how that gets set up, because workman's comp is a very common thing, and I really encourage that you get those set up in the payroll program. So after I've selected the type, I'm going to press enter, and I'm just going to call it WC. And WC for workman's comp. And if you have different comp codes, what you could also do too is put in that actual code number. Maybe I want to replace that here as well, because most employers, contracting employers, have different workman's comp code for different types of work: electrical, plumbing, sewer, heating, excavating. All the different types of work that you do can be related to their own workman's comp codes. Even clerical is its own workman's comp code. So as I press enter, you can also relate as any liability to their general ledger liability and payroll expense accounts in your general ledger. And in the case of workman's comp, you want to use a calculation method that we have written specifically for workman's comp, because the calculation method tells COBRA how the employer liability is going to be calculated. And in the case of workman's comp, we know that this is the calculation method you want to use. Basically, it means that regardless of the type of hours worked, straight time, overtime, double time, you want everything calculated at the straight time hours rate, basically. So I'm going to select that calculation method, and because this liability is not a union benefit, I do not have to relate it to a a union code. If this were a union benefit, as these at the left are, I have already related those to their particular union codes or union reports that I want this reported to. I'm just going to keep pressing enter down here. Now the vendor account, just like with any item in the payroll, be it a tax, a liability, a deduction, a benefit, you can relate those items to the particular vendors in the AP that you pay them with. Now if you're setting up payroll first, as most people are, and you're setting up payroll accounts payable next, you can come back and resave each of your liabilities to the vendor that you normally pay them to. So, and it's just as simple as clicking into that lookup and double clicking on the vendor to whom you're going to pay it. I'll take that out for now. As I press enter, I'm brought down to the first checkbox called Must Attach to Pay Rate. Now this is a very important checkbox because when it comes to workman's compensation and union benefits in particular, you only want this item, in this case workman's comp, to be calculated against the hours that are related to this workman's comp code. So you'll see later on when we actually get to attaching everything together in pay rates, what that means is that when we set up a pay rate that represents my 8130 workers or electrical workers or whoever they are, that means that only the hours paid against that pay rate will have this workman's comp item calculated against it. So if a single worker works in two different areas, electrical and plumbing, they obviously have two different workman's comp codes, so the hours that are related to just electrical will be calculated against one workman's comp code and plumbing against its own. Same thing with union benefits. So this is a very important checkbox to turn on when it comes to workman's comp and union benefits. Now after I have saved my benefit, and I can do so when I'm done at the bottom here, just pressing enter. Before I save it, I do want to show you about this new feature called Show on Check Stub, because not everybody wants their employer liabilities and in deductions have the same feature to show up on check stubs, so you don't have to. I usually recommend that you do have them on check stubs, but in the case of union benefits, your check stub can be quite lengthy with all the union benefits. So that's a personal choice. Leave that on or off. Once I save the employer liability, it will then show up on my list here at the left. So the last thing I need to do is double click on it so it appears right above here in blue, right above the general tab. And I need to enter my level, and all a level is just a record that tells COBRA how to calculate or what your rate is and what your minimum and maximum is against that rate. So I'm going to click the new tab at the lower right, and I'm just going to put in the description field number 1 that represents the first level and usually the only level of an employer liability. Now the minimum amount means how much of pay would they normally start at having this employer liability calc'd against. So usually that is 0. So as soon as they start making money or getting paid, they'll have this liability calc'd against it. When I press enter, I'm brought to the maximum amount, which means is there a limit to how much an employee could make to have this workman's comp calculated against it. If there is no limit, put all 9s in here. Otherwise, you can just put the maximum dollar amount to which to calculate this liability against. A similar thing is on FICA medical and FICA Social Security. So if you want examples of the minimum and maximum amounts, those are great examples to double click and look at. When I press enter, I'm brought down to the rate field. So the rate represents either the dollar amount or the rate of pay, I should say, yes, percentage rate, that the benefit is being calculated against, or the workman's comp is being calculated against. So it really is determined by the calculation method that was set up for this item. In this case, this is set up against an hourly rate. So when I come back to the levels tab, I can click back into the rate and say, well, this is being calculated at 50% per hour or whatever it is. Now let's take a look at a couple of other union benefits. Now, as I scroll across the bottom of the screen, It's nice having examples to show you, because when we take a look at different calculation methods, you can see what I mean by what the rate is in the level. So when I double click on this union benefit, it's been all set up at the right with its union code, very important, and must attach to pay rate, also very important, as you'll see later. But this calculation method says this is really an hourly amount. So when I click into the Levels tab, you can see that this is being calculated at an hourly rate of $1.32 an hour. Now if I double click on a union benefit that's based on a rate, you again see the union code, must attach to pay rate, those important things. But when I go into the levels, the rate represents the hourly percentage rate that the benefit will be calculated on. So that is why, depending on the calculation method, how you're going to use this rate, be it an hourly percentage or an hourly dollar amount. Excellent. This ends the lesson on working in the Employer Liabilities tab.